Welcome to this installment of Thank You for Your Service. My name is Tom Heiser and I will be your host. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps were the first women, other than nurses, to serve within the rank of the United States Army. Today we will be talking with Sara Parsons, who was one of the original WAC'S in World War II. Sara, thank you for meeting with me and thank you for your service.
You're welcome.
What we'd like to do, Sara, is tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from and where you grew up.
Well, I was born in Wisconsin Rapids, which was then Grand Rapids. I'm the fourth generation of my family on both sides to have lived in Wisconsin Rapids. I graduated from high school, Lincoln High School, and up until the time I was 21, I had such a dull life that I can't even remember it. When I was 21, Pearl Harbor came, and I was engaged to be married, and my husband was a reserve officer and was immediately called in, and so we were married, went over to Appleton, went into a house. I think we were married, and he was immediately sent to Maryland. We were only together about a week, and he was sent overseas, and I was left in a farmhouse in Maryland with a car, a bicycle, and $100. I decided that a notice came out in the paper that they were going to admit women into the Army and in New York City. So I sold the car and went to New York and joined the Army. There were WAACs at that time, later WACs. The reason I joined the Army was that I would be able to be with my husband if I was also in the Army. And that was probably about the dumbest thing that I'd ever done, because there wasn't any chance. Do you want me to go on and talk more?
Well, when you said your husband got sent overseas, did he get sent to Europe or where did he get sent?
Actually, he was sent to the Panama Canal Zone, which was a little luckier than in Europe. But anyway, he was gone. And there were about 20 of us that signed up, had a physical in Des Moines, Iowa, for our basic training. Back then, when women traveled on the train, they dressed up on the train. They dressed up with a hat with a veil and bike heels and white gloves, which we all wore. We got out to Fort Des Moines, and an old sergeant with a truck said, "Climb up in the truck." And so we took off our white gloves at this point, got into the truck, and rattled out to Fort Des Moines. We were housed, Fort Des Moines was a cavalry post, and we were housed in one of the places where the horses had been, and they hadn't left early enough because it smelled of horse. But anyway, our beds were about 15 feet apart, and the old sergeant obviously was not happy to have women in the Army. Who would want a woman as their commanding officer? He yelled, "Fall out," and we weren't quite sure what that meant. We knew how to fall down, but we didn't know how to fall out. At this point, we went over to the depot to get uniforms. They didn't have any WAC uniforms, so we were given men's uniforms, size 46, and we put those on. By now we took off the hats with the veil and marched back to the barracks. I was, of course, a private, and I worked in the kitchen, did washing dishes most of the time. I was wondering if I hadn't made a big mistake joining the Army. As I was washing the hundreds of plates, I looked out and I saw that the officers were driving by with their chauffeur to go to the officers' club to have a cocktail. So this immediately told me that I had to become an officer. I wrote to Colonel Faith, I still remember his name, a fine gentleman, and gave my qualifications, which weren't very many, that I wanted to go to officer candidate school. No answer. I wrote again, no answer. So I almost gave up. But when I finished basic training, I got a notice that I had been accepted in officer school. I went 3 months and got my gold bars, and it was probably one of the biggest events in my life, and I needed...
Okay, so you got your commission.
I'm now an officer, and my first assignment was to Daytona Beach, Florida. This was in January, so this was an ideal assignment. This Daytona Beach was a training center for the women. They lived in the fancy hotels, and I was immediately a second officer for about 135 new women coming in. We trained them for 1 week, clothed them, and sent them to special schools or out into the field. The WAC'S was expanding so rapidly that within a very short time, I was the commanding officer of that number of young women. And that, you don't have my book here, do you? I was going to read the little about the cadre. Well, we'll skip that. Okay. I was in Florida for approximately a year. My second assignment was the harbor defenses of Long Island Sound. I was with an anti-aircraft battalion that was guarding New York City and other cities in that area from attack from the Germans. Now I want to mention now that in the beginning, the women and the men had separate jobs. The women did not handle any of the arms. They did the cooking, they were the auto mechanics, they were the dentists, they were the librarians, they were everything that did not require combat. Now that's all been changed. I'm not sure I approve of it. I was there for approximately a year, and it was an island out in the middle of the Atlantic called Fort Terry. The civilian name is Plum Island, off the coast of New London. We had to take a boat from New London to get to the island, and kind of an interesting sidelight here was a cousin of mine who considered joining the WAC'S, and she wanted to go to the post and see what was about. Well, we had to go by train to New London, Connecticut, and then we had to catch the boat. Well, we were a little late, and but did manage to get on the boat to go back to Fort Terry. as we were leaving, there was a lot of shooting and noise, and she wanted to know what that was. And I said, well, we're a target boat. And that discouraged her right away. But we went to Fort Terry, and as we got off the boat, there was an alert. And when we had an alert, we each had a post to go to. And my post was quite a distance, and so I rode on the back of a motorcycle to where I was supposed to be. When we got on Fort Terry, this was all Army, and you can imagine how happy the Army personnel were to have a bunch of women on the island. The problem was they had a barracks for the enlisted personnel, but I was the commanding officer, the only woman officer. And where were they going to put me? Were they going to put me in the house with the senior officers, or were they going to put me in the house with the junior officers? I didn't really much care. They decided to put me with the junior officers, and I immediately had a lock put on the bathroom door. The experience at Fort Terry was very interesting, and one interesting point was that it was on a long island, and we found out later that some German troops had landed on our island and apparently lived there for about a week before they were discovered. They never caused any trouble, and apparently left for someplace by then. I have to think a minute about some of the highlights. Well, okay, after a while, the Germans surrendered, and Fort Terry was closed down. I was sent to Fort Devens in Massachusetts, which is a hospital station, and it was very, very hard to see all the injured soldiers that were in the hospital there. And at this particular place, Fort Devens, the commanding officer had just gone through a very bitter divorce, and he didn't like women, and he especially did not like women in service. And so I was given a job to do office work, to supervise people that I didn't have the slightest idea what they were doing. I was just filling in time because the Germans had surrendered. When we went to the colonel, and there were four of us, 4 WAC'S that went there. We were all officers, and we asked the colonel where we were going to, which house we were going to be in, and the houses went up a hill. The second lieutenants were the first ones, and then the first lieutenants, and so on. The 4 officers and myself were put in a World War I barracks. He was going to show women that they shouldn't be in the Army, I think. I went to him and suggested that we get a house. And he said, "You've got a house." And that was that. So we all got together. By now the war had quieted down, and decided that we'd play a trick on him. We went into town, and we bought pink paint and purple paint and orange paint, and we began to paint our World War I barracks on the outside with these colors. It took about 30 minutes before the commanding colonel rushed up in his car, came at us, and used every swear word I've ever heard. And we just innocently said, "Well, sir, we're just trying to make it look a little better." And he told us to stop, which we did. But it worked, because the next day orders came down that we would have his house that he was not living in. So we lived in the top house on that. And now that, shortly after that, I'd been given a job that I really didn't know anything about how to do it, and so I took a discharge. Now, do you want me to go back, or do you want to ask some questions about it?
You had a book. What's the title of your book?
The what?
What's the title of the book that you wrote?
Was First WAC.
Okay, First WAC. And I had the opportunity to read a little bit about that book. During your career, you got to meet Eleanor Roosevelt, correct?
Oh, yes. That was when I was in training. Eleanor Roosevelt came to inspect the troops, and I was chosen to take her around, which was a big thrill. She was a delightful person. You felt very, very much at ease with her. And so I spent the entire day taking her around to the various companies and so on. And then about a year later, I was on a train, and she was on the train, and I went up to her and asked her if she remembered me, and whether she did or not, I don't know, but she said, "Oh, yes." And she had kind of a high little voice, and it was a very outstanding pleasure for me to have spent the day with Eleanor Roosevelt. Any other?
Okay, when you were in Fort Des Moines, you said you were doing a lot of dishes, you were doing a lot of KP. So there were other people at Fort Des Moines just besides the WAC'S? Was there?
Oh yes. It was a cavalry post, and it was fully occupied by soldiers at that time. And all we did was our basic training there, and then the officer candidate school was at another fort, and there were about 20 in our class, and every time we'd come back from our lessons, there'd be 19 or 18, so they were constantly washing out, some of them. And to avoid that, I studied twice as hard. And when the lights were out, I went down in the latrine and still studied, because I was determined that I was going to be an officer. And my husband was an officer. And it was my ambition to outrank him. But I never did. And he was gone for almost 3 years. And it was a very, very interesting experience to have been the first WAC. Another thing I want to mention is about Mary Ellen Daly. When I was in Florida, I noticed that one company had Mary Ellen Daly in it from Wisconsin Rapids. Now, Mary Ellen Daly was a sister of James Daly, who was a movie star, and the aunt of Tyne Daly. Now, both of these actors are from some time ago, but I think anybody from Wisconsin Rapids would remember Tyne Daly. And I was very happy to see her. And an interesting, when the war was over, I had no intention of remaining in the military. I was married, I wanted to have children. Had I not been married, I think it would be a wonderful career. And Mary Ellen did stay in. She was not married. She stayed in the Army, and I have heard later that she was discharged as a full colonel. And wouldn't I have loved to be a full colonel? I think it's a wonderful career for women. I have mixed feelings about them in combat. I think they want to be in combat because they want to be equal to the men. And certainly when I first joined and turned up and put on the size 46 uniform, we were not popular at Fort Devens. There are very few soldiers that, even after I became an officer, I was not saluted. And I would call the soldier, the enlisted soldier, over and say, you're saluting the gold bars on my shoulder, and I don't want you to pass me by again without a salute. And I think the quality of the women that we had in the Army was very, very high. I was one of the younger ones, had no particular career before, but a great many of them were highly educated, and to this day, I think the women in the Army are respected. They go to West Point, and they are on an equal basis with the men, and I feel in some small way I perhaps opened that door for the women in the Army today. Anything else?
Yes, you mentioned that your husband went to Panama for his duty. Did he stay the whole war in Panama, or did he go other places?
He did. And happily that he wasn't in combat. However, my oldest son was in Vietnam, and for about a year and a half. And he was drafted. He never signed, but he was drafted. And this concerned me a great deal. I still wonder if we should be in Vietnam. And when it was his birthday, he was enlisted. He was a corporal, I believe. I wanted to send him a birthday present, and I got one of the rubber chickens that you can buy, and I put captain's bars on the chicken and sent it to him so he could hang that up so the captain would see what I thought of it. So,
okay, you mentioned some other ladies. You mentioned Ms. Daly. There was a lady from Port Edwards.
yes. Very early in the war, a young woman by the name of Ruth Briggs, who lived in Port Edwards, became a WAC, and was on her way, I believe, to Italy. And her ship was torpedoed, and she was saved, and I'm not sure about the other woman, but Ruth Briggs was saved. I've never met Ruth Briggs, but I think people from Wisconsin Rapids and Port Edwards probably would know her. Oh, this is a long, long, long time ago that this occurred. But I personally was proud to have served, and I'm looking for a hat that says Second World War on it to wear. and I think my son has a business in Door County, and I had a Foot Locker that he wanted to use in one of his stores, and it had Lieutenant S.J. Parsons on, and somebody asked him, who's S.J. Parsons? And he says, that's my mom. Your mom was in the Army? Because I was in such a long time ago. My book has a picture of me on it, and it says First WAC, and I was one of the first WAC'S. And
So you were a commanding officer.
I was a commanding, promotions were fast. When I went to Daytona Beach, I was second officer. And very soon, because of the expansion, I was a commanding officer at 22. And we had like 130 women to train, but we had a large cadre of, I wish I had that poem of the cadre, but I don't know. I had 10 cadre who assisted. One was in charge of uniforms, one was in charge of food, but I was the commanding officer, and I have pictures of myself marching and leading the group, and boy, at 22, that's pretty delightful.
So at 22, there were actually some people in your unit that were much older than you.
Oh, I think almost all. And almost all of them were older. And particularly when I took a group to Fort Terry, I had quite a few that were mothers of soldiers that were in, the mother and the soldier were both in. But, well, I guess I'm a bossy person, so, but the whole experience was very worthwhile, and what else do you want to?
Okay, so your husband is in Panama. Do you write back and forth a lot?
Did
you write letters to your husband? He wrote back to you quite a bit?
Well, I never, I saw him once in 3 years. An interesting thing is that as an officer, he was receiving a compensation for me as his wife. And it wasn't any great amount, but when I joined, he lost that, and what I got was $21 a month. That was the pay of the private at that time. I wonder what it is now, but it was $21 a month was our pay. And of course, before we became officers, we worked like slaves. And I don't think in the beginning that we were popular. And I think that perhaps the male soldiers thought that women were just not tough enough, I guess, to be in the Army. But I think the company that I was with proved that we could do a job and do it well. And of course now I believe there are about 25% of the women are officers, and of course they go to West Point, and I don't know if there's still discrimination. I don't believe there is anymore. I think the women have proved, and we were the first. And then of course there was the Navy and the Marines, but they came later. The Army was the first one. And it was interesting when I came back to Wisconsin Rapids, nobody had ever seen a woman in uniform. And I was asked to talk at the Elks Club and the Women's Club and the high school, And I was just loving every bit of it. I was just loving every bit of it. And as I say, if I hadn't been married and wanted children, I would have stayed in the Army, and I'd probably take Eisenhower's place.
So during your career, did you ever command any men? Were there ever any men in any of
Never, never. It was, I don't know just when. Now, of course, there's no difference. There's women commanding men all the time. And I think this was when we arrived at Fort Des Moines, and we were treated rudely. We were treated rudely, but we looked like such freaks in these huge uniforms and the high-heel shoes. I think the women had to prove that they could do it. And now, of course, they are in combat, and I don't know how my feeling is towards that. I suppose your promotions are better if you are actually in combat. And if you make a career, you want to go as far as you can. I was second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and my promotion to captain had just come through shortly before I was discharged. I was discharged because the job I had was just filling in something. I had no idea. I was to supervise people that I didn't have the slightest idea what they were doing. It was just but one interesting thing about Fort Devens, we had prisoners of war as workers at Fort Devens. They were the waiters and lawn keepers and everything. They were from Germany, and they were trying to learn to speak English. And they were the waiters in the mess halls. And if we said no potatoes, we would get nothing but potatoes. And so it was better to just take what was on the menu or not. And they were young men that probably had not wanted to be in the war any more than any of the Americans. They became our friends. We liked those Germans just because they were the enemy. They were innocently caught up in the war, and we enjoyed their company, and they worked hard, but we just shouldn't say no potatoes. But they were fine young men, and well, we admired them. We admired them. They were not our enemies. They were not our enemies. They were just caught up in the war. And interesting sideline here was I was in the Army, and when I was born, women were not even allowed to vote. So we have come a long ways, and probably have a long ways to go, but I'm sure some younger women will. I don't think anybody that was in that first company, that 20, probably are not alive anymore.
So during your time in the military, did you receive any medals or citations?
No, I got no. I think that is mainly for combat. I'm not sure, but no, I had no citations at all.
But did you receive any medals or ribbons or anything?
No, nothing. Maybe they weren't. I don't know. There's probably something you have to do to earn them. I really don't know why. I know women now have the citations, but things have changed a great deal in that many years. They've changed very, very much. It took, the hardest thing, I think, for the women in the Army was to be accepted as equal to the men. And they did their job, and the ones at Fort Terry were auto mechanics, all kinds of jobs, everything except actually handling. It was an anti-aircraft battalion, and they did not handle the weapons, but they did everything else, and they were good marchers too.
What was some of the funny things that you recall that still bring a smile to your face today of what you did when you were in the Army?
Well, funny things. I'm trying to. I right now. I suppose there were. Well, one thing was kind of interesting. As I say, I was at Fort Terry, and a cousin of mine had considered joining the WAC'S, and so she wanted to go out on to the island, and so we took the train to New London. Did I tell you this before? No, I don't think so. Oh, anyway, and we got on the boat, and it took 2 hours to go to Fort Terry, and we were. I didn't tell you this before, did I? No. We were eating on the boat. We were having supper. Did I?
You had mentioned a little bit about it, but there's probably more.
Yeah, and they started shooting, and she got so nervous that she put her elbow in the food, and then as soon as we got to Fort Terry, there was an alert, and she decided right away that she wasn't going to join the Army, and she didn't, but well, financially, my husband lost money because he was getting more money from me, probably $80, than the $25 that I was doing. So none of us went in the Army to get rich, and but a tremendous number of women signed up, and they were a lot of them were very outstanding. Many of them, as I said, had sons in the Army, and I don't think there was any age limit there because many they were in their 40s and 50s, and I think 21 was the youngest that you could get in, but I don't quite remember that, but it was an experience. It was an experience.
What lessons did you learn from the military that you carried on from the rest of your life? What are the things that you learned?
Well, neatness, I think. When I was an officer at Fort Terry, they had what they called a striker. And a striker would be a male, and all the others, there were no women there, so they were strikers for men. And they would come in, and they would make your bed, and they would polish your brass, and they would shine your shoes. Well, when I came as a woman officer, I had a male striker, and that gave me a kick that he was shining my shoes for me. But he was an enlisted man, and he shined the shoes. And Daytona was very delightful, but I think I enjoyed Fort Terry more because we were more in the active part. And I would like to have a reunion and see all those people again.
So you mentioned you got to see your husband once in 3 years.
Once in 3 years.
Did he come up to see you, or where did you guys get to see each other?
He got a leave. I don't know if he even had a leave. He may have been AWL, and we met in New Orleans for a couple of days. But I was just so happy that he was not in combat, and very upset when my son was drafted and was in Vietnam. And he's done very, very well with the business in Door County. But when he came back from Vietnam, he bummed around for quite a while. He bought a trailer, and he didn't settle down. It took him a long time to settle down and to start a business in Door County. He was sort of a drifter.
So what did
and
you...
I think that is one of the crimes of war. You take these young men and they're not used to this, and it shatters their personality. So many of, now, not many, but will go into crime, or it's a tremendous, must be a tremendous mental strain to shoot another person. How can we do that? How can we do that? And will it ever end? Will it ever end?
What was your husband's job when he was in the Army?
His civilian job?
No, when he was in the Army, what was his job down in Panama?
He was a chemist. He had a PhD in chemistry. And I don't know if they used his skill at all. I don't know what it was. He was from Maine, and I'm sure he joined the reserve to help him get through college. He had his PhD, and I think he thought there'd never be a war. He was not a typical soldier. He was very upset when he was called in, but I think he did it for the money to become a soldier, and I'm sure he's a good soldier, but we'd been married such a very short time that I hardly knew him when he came back. I hardly knew him. But we had a long, good marriage, and it's just part of life.
So what did you do after you got discharged from the WAC'S?
Had babies. Okay. Back then, mothers did not work very often, and I had children, and then later, I actually had worked for the railroad for a short while, and I did fill in on vacations for the railroad, but there wasn't daycare for children, and later in life, I worked at the Macmillan Library for about 10 years as eventually head of the circulation department. But other than that, I never worked. I just...
Being a mother is work.
Hmm?
Being a mother is work.
Well, we had a very interesting life because my husband had jobs all over the world, and we lived in Turkey, and we lived in many countries in South America, and there was a big cutback in employment in Consolidated, and when he was in his 50s, a terrible blow, And it turned out the luckiest thing that ever happened to us, because we had all these adventures in different countries, and it was a good life. But I'm proud of being in the Army. I'm proud of being in the Army. And I get all this free food on Veterans Day.
So, is there anything else that you want to tell about your life in your time in the military?
Well, it's been a very good life, good family. And it's been a long life. And I don't know, do you have any other questions?
Sara, your story is amazing.
Oh, not really.
Oh, you were a pioneer
Not really.
in the military with the
It
WAC'S.
was in the beginning. As I say, I was 21, and well, Colonel Faith was a wonderful man, but his sergeants did not treat us well. Did not treat us well. They were tough on us. They were going to toughen us up. If we were in the Army, they were going to toughen us up. But then, as we sort of did a good job at Fort Terry, I was the only woman, and I know that I was respected by my troops, and I was respected by Colonel Moore, and I feel I did a good job. I feel I did a good job, and they saluted me then.
I salute you too. Thank you for your service. Thank you very much.